What I want to teach on tonight is I want to teach on rewards. Um, and this really got started because I got an email from a guy who it was actually, just challenged. Why do you teach so much on rewards? And my answer was twofold. I said, well, first of all, I teach a lot on rewards because I think Jesus Christ taught a lot about rewards, and I think the New Testament does as well. And then the other thing I think is that the church, you can listen to an awful lot of Christian radio and an awful lot of Christian TV and never hear a word about rewards. And that's because the church historic doesn't know where to put it. I mean, people die and they go to heaven. And then, where do rewards come in? And so there's not a lot of talk about it. So what I did is I just, at the beach, I just started kind of, and I'm not through yet, but I just picked up Matthew, and I just read through Matthew, and then I read through Mark, and I'm reading through Luke, and, just saying, where are these places where Christ mentions rewards? And it's an ongoing study, but it's one I wanted to start with you tonight. And the caveat, if you will, that I think we all have, I'll speak for myself in first person, is that I have to be very careful in my study of things like rewards because I know what my life is like. Like I'll wake up in the morning and, like this morning was really hectic and, my wife and I woke up late and so everything was in a frenzy. And it was, it was well into the morning before I stopped and went, wait a minute, I haven't spoken in tongues like one word all morning long. And then I'm reproving myself and saying, where's my head and where's my focus and this kind of thing. And my experience from talking to others is that we are much harder on ourselves. I think that, when the New Testament talks about receiving a rich welcome into the kingdom, I think, people like us here in this meeting, we're dedicating our time, we're manifesting the Spirit, we're trying to walk by the Spirit, what James said about we're hearing from God all the time and trying to walk out on that. I think from God's perspective, we're probably really heroes. And sometimes that we can be down on ourselves about things that we see that are weak spots. That then when when I read about rewards, then sometimes, and I read it, Christianity Today and Charisma and these guys that go off to foreign countries in some weird place in Africa, and they live out of a cardboard box for 30 years and eat bugs so that they can share the scripture with people. And I'm like, wow, and then, but I think we have to be cautious because I think really we can read about rewards and then feel like, man, I don't know if I deserve these, but we really do. And we just need to be aware of it. But rewards is a very exciting to me at the same time, because we know that there really is going to be a richness for people that have done things for the Lord. The Lord is not he's faithful to remember what we've done for him. So having said that, I just started in Matthew. So let's go to Matthew chapter 5. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. And this is the first mention of rewards that I found in Matthew. So we'll go to Matthew chapter 5. And what I'm going to do in this teaching is just kind of run down some of the list of what I saw and what was going on. And we can talk about it as I go. But Matthew chapter 5, and in verse 11, this is, like I say, the Sermon on the Mount. And Christ says, "Blessed are you when people reproach you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven." A couple things to explain here. One is, why does it say great is your reward in heaven? Well, Christ hadn't conquered the earth yet. So as people are doing good works for God, and the book of Malachi says God is writing a book of remembrance about when you do something great for God, then God's got angel scribes. I'm sure God has some library up there that looks like the Library of Congress with all the billions of people that are alive, where he's got all these angels busy writing things down. And if you remember, even in the book of Revelation at the final judgment, it says the books were opened and the dead were judged out of those things that were written in the books. And so, there's these angel scribes up there, and they're writing stuff down. And so where are those books kept? Where are those rewards right now? They're in God's keeping and in God's promise. And so they're considered to be in heaven. They're certainly not on earth. It's not like anybody's going to uncover a cave or something and say, wow, look at all this hidden treasure down here, and find God's cave of rewards. So that's why it says that it says great is your reward in heaven, not because we're going to get the reward in heaven, but because that's where the reward is now, stored with God. And then I think, when verse 11 says, blessed are you when people reproach you and persecute you and say all kinds of evil things against you falsely for my name's sake. And why would people do that? Because we're witnessing, because we're taking a stand against evil, because we're trying to interrupt the devil's plans. So basically, for people who are out trying aggressively to move the kingdom of God forward and truly be ambassadors, and represent Jesus Christ on earth, which obviously upsets evil people, then you get persecuted and stuff. And what does Christ say? Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. He doesn't just say, yeah, there's probably a reward in heaven for that. When we're, like I say, there's 7.7 billion people on the planet. How many of them are even remotely aggressively trying to promote the kingdom? We're really rare people. And I love that Christ would say, great is your reward in heaven. And we've got to think that way about ourselves. Then a little further down in the Sermon on the Mount in verse 19, talking about the commandments. Now back in those days, of course, he's talking about the commandments written for the Jews. For you and I, we are under a different set of commandments because we have the New Testament epistles and stuff, but the principle is the same. Verse 19, therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. So, you go out and teach people to break God's commands. God says, wow, you're not going to have a very high position in the kingdom. You're going to be one of the least in the kingdom. But then he goes on to say, but whoever does them, if we obey the word. And looking around at this group, we're people that love God. We're people that obey the word. And we're people that teach others to obey the word. And he says, whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I don't know exactly how that's going to look. Do we get to wear a sash or a little crown, or like the army or something? You have all the little badges. I don't know what that means exactly, but I do know that when Christ says this, this is really important, and so it behooves us then to take some time out of our life and say, okay, what are the commands of God? Am I doing them? Am I not doing them? How am I doing? How can I improve? What am I doing great in? Because you got to give yourself attaboys. You can't, a lot of times people make the mistake of looking at where they're weak and spending their time constantly trying to improve where they're weak. And that's not the best use of time. A better use of time is to find out where you're really good and go out and hit a bunch of home runs. People that know me intimately know that, excuse me, that I'm not the best listener in the world. I could take a bunch of classes and I could try to be the world's greatest listener, but I'd do much better if I'd work on my teaching, because that I do really well, and really hit some home runs. And you find out where are you really good, and maximize that. Don't focus on it. There's nothing wrong with, trying to improve where you need improvement, but don't get sucked into the vortex of spending your life trying to do that. When we obey God and go and tell others to obey God, that's a great way of being great in the kingdom. Still in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, and verse 1, Matthew 6, and he says, "Be careful not to do your acts of righteousness in front of people in order to be seen by them. For then you have no reward laid up with your Father who is in heaven. Therefore, when you give to the needy, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, so that they will have glory from people. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward." You and I don't want a reward from people. We want a reward from God. And that takes humility. And in today's culture, I was thinking about this today, in today's culture, that can mean swimming upstream a little bit. Like, when you're, for people that are on Facebook all the time, I know from talking to people that are on Facebook all the time that they're constantly trying to think up things about themselves that they can put on Facebook. This is where I ate today. This is what I did today. This is what I wore today. This is who I talked to today. This is what I read today. And what happens is the very process of having to constantly think about what you're doing so you can put it out for other people so that they know what you are doing. Guys, frankly, we're not that important. We really aren't. And from God's perspective, what we're supposed to be doing is trying to figure out how.
So here I am.
Hello. There we go. What we're supposed to be doing is trying to figure out how we can elevate God and Jesus and others and downplay ourselves. And, and we see it right here in this. And he says, verse 3, "When you give to the needy, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing," which obviously is, that's a figure of speech, a custom, meaning don't let the people who are close to you know what's going on, so that your charitable giving is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And there's the reward. So basically what it's saying is, when we do good things for other people, we want our reward for God and that from God, and that should be enough. And other people don't need to know about it. They don't need to know what we're doing. We don't need to, get into that kind of situation. Same thing when he talks about praying. Verse 5, he goes right on. "When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites, for they delight in standing and praying in the synagogues, the corners of the street, in order to be seen by people." And that's the key, that they pray so that they can be seen. And he says they've received their reward. "When you pray, enter into your inner room, having shut your door, pray to your Father who's in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you." And again, there's a focus on rewards there. Same thing with fasting. If we go down to verse 16, so, and we're still in the Sermon on the Mount. There's been a fair amount about rewards in the teaching of Jesus just in this one teaching. that he's giving. So we go down to verse 16. When you fast, don't be gloomy like the hypocrites, for they make their faces unattractive, so their fasting is obvious to people. Truly I say to you, they wanted to be seen, they've been seen, they have their reward. But you, when you're fast, and why would you be fasting? You'd be fasting for some purpose of God that you want to accomplish, or you want God to do, or you want things to move in the spiritual world, or you want to be obedient to some of the customs of the time. So the whole purpose of the fasting, today a lot of people fast for health, and that's great too. But in this culture, people, there wasn't enough food for most people that they didn't need to fast for health. So they were fasting for other things, to get God to move, if you will. And he says, when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face. This is between you and God, so that your fasting will not be obvious to people, but only to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you. And again, here is, how's he going to repay you? That's rewards in the kingdom. And we go on to verse 19, following right up on fasting. And he says, don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth. And you guys know what treasures on earth is. And down here, there's moth, there's rust, there's thieves. And store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Well, how are we going to do that? How in the world do you store up a treasure in heaven? You can't exactly just get in an airplane and fly it up to God. What you do is you do something that is forwarding the kingdom of God. You in your life, in your ministry, in your relationship with God, you are focusing on God. How can I help you? How can I be an ambassador for Christ? How can I move your kingdom forward? What can I do to help you? And then what are you doing when you do that? Well, you're storing up treasure in heaven. And that's, there's no moths up there. There's no rust. There's no thieves. And then verse 21 is beautiful because it says, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. And the more time we spend obeying God and trying to think, okay, God, what can I do for you today? The more treasure we focus on for God, then all of a sudden our heart shifts. And that becomes easy to do. And it's a blessing and it's fun. There are things that I do for God that, sometimes I'm like, okay, God, I'll do it and whatever. But I'm astounded at so many people that act like obeying God is so difficult. Like somehow or other, it's easier to lie than to tell the truth. It's easier to get drunk than to stay sober. It's more, it's like, no, it isn't. As you educate your conscience to obey God, obeying God becomes so powerful, so much fun, so wonderful. I am just amazed, and then we just follow God and obey Him. Let's see. So we were in Matthew 6. Let's go to Matthew chapter 10. So Matthew 10, and we'll be in verse 40. So pretty far down. And now Christ is sending out the apostles here. And in verse 40, he says, whoever receives you receives me. And whoever receives me receives him who sent me. Whoever receives a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. Now, if you're a prophet, this requires great humility on your part, because, when you are called into a particular ministry, then there's often a lot of stress that goes with that. And what does Christ say? Walk on your ministry, do your ministry, and don't belittle what you can do. It reminds me of the woman that poured the oil on Christ's head just before his crucifixion. And, Judas Iscariot started murmuring, why was this waste of ointment made? And then he was able to infect the rest of the apostles. And then pretty soon all the apostles are murmuring, and why was this waste of ointment made? And I love Christ's answer, and I've held on to this for so many years, that Christ looked at them and he said, leave her alone. She has done what she could. And that has meant so much to me through the years, because I've seen so many people that are in positions where they just, either because of their economics or their time crunch or the amount of time they have to spend working or their family hassles or whatever, they don't have the freedom to do what I do. Or maybe they don't have the resources to do what I do, or what you do in your ministry, whatever your ministry is, if you're an evangelist or if you're a teacher or whatever, and and you look at them, and just because of life circumstances, it doesn't look like, wow, Lord, what can they do? And God just looks and says, they've done what they could. And that is so powerful, that we have no right and really no ability to look at anybody else's life and decide what they can or can't do, or should or shouldn't be doing for the Lord. And this is just, to me, this is so powerful. That there are people out there, can they be a prophet? No, for whatever reason, they're not called to be a prophet, or they don't have the time, or they don't have the resources, or whatever it is, but gosh, they can give a cup of cold water to a prophet in the name of a prophet. And what does Scripture say? And you'll get a prophet's reward. And I just love that. And I think that that's just something that we need to kind of hold in our hearts. It's such an encouraging word for people to, when people come and they're kind of down. And I ran into one of these guys recently, and he was just kind of down on himself and couldn't do much, and wrestling with this and health issues and wrestling with that. And yet he was doing what he could. And we just need to have that word of encouragement. And I love this, 41, whoever receives a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. So here in Matthew chapter 10, and what Christ's talking about, he's saying, look, you're going to get rewarded for doing what you can. And whoever receives a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. And whoever gives one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink in the name of a disciple, truly I say to you, he will not ever lose his reward. And sometimes we downplay what we can do, and we think, well, this isn't very much. And we've just got to let that go, and we've got to help people see the greatness of what they do in their service for God, and how wonderful it is from God's perspective that people would help each other out like that. And then we hop over to Matthew 16. And this is Jesus Christ talking about him coming. Verse 27. And the context starts like back up in verse 24. Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And, the extreme of this would be some kind of martyr or something like that. But really, honestly, it just says if you want to save your life, you lose it. And how do you lose your life? You lose your life in other people. You esteem other people better than yourself. You esteem the work of God better than the things that you want to do. And that's what Christ says. You've got to deny yourself and take up your cross and follow me. And it's easy to base some of our decisions on that. Like we could make a decision to keep 100% of the money we make, or we can say, you know what, I'm going to give some of this away. we can make the decision to spend all of our time on ourselves, or we can say, I'm going to figure out how to spend some of my time on other people. And that's what this thing is talking about. You want to come after, we deny ourselves, we take up our cross. It's not that big a deal. We just do it. It can come at a sacrifice sometimes, but by and large, then it's like James said, then the Lord's talking to you, Jesus Christ is talking to you, and that stuff lights you up. When you're getting revelation from God, and that just lights you up inside. It's amazing. And then verse 28, Christ says, truly I say to you, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, verse 27, for the Son of Man is about to come with his angels and in the glory of his Father. And then now remember, the treasure's been up in heaven. So here comes Christ down to earth with his angels in the glory of his Father. And then he will repay each person according to what he's done. So we will get repaid for what we've done. And there's nothing wrong with focusing on that. Absolutely. Look at Matthew chapter 18. Now you could tell this is kind of cool. This is like, to me, this is like little 4-year-old Eli, who finally it clicked for him that being thankful for the food was really important. And so here's the disciples, and Christ has been teaching about the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and this you'll get repaid for this and repaid for that. And how can you tell? The apostles, and by the way, we believe that the best evidence is that the apostles at this time in the ministry of Christ were in their late teens, maybe early 20s, but basically in their late teens. Verse 1 of Matthew 18, in that hour, the disciples came to Jesus saying, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, what were they asking? What do they mean by that? Well, they know that Christ is going to come down from heaven. He's going to conquer the earth. He's going to set up his kingdom, and that kingdom is going to be called the kingdom of heaven. And here are the disciples, and so they go to Christ, and this is a great question. Lord, who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who's going to be like the top dog? Who's going to be like the vizier of the king? And what a great target to shoot for. That they would grasp the concept. I'm sure, there's one sense when they asked this, I'm sure that Christ kind of said, okay, you're not getting the part about humility yet. But the other side of the coin is he could be saying, wow, you really get it, that the Lord is going to repay you for your efforts. That's so cool, because you can draw energy from that when you need it. It's like a battery pack. When you need energy to dig a little deeper, you can draw energy from that. So they come to him, and who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And he's like, okay, this is the humility part. And he called him a little child, set it in the midst of them, and said, truly I say to you, unless you change, because up to that point, they're kids, they're kids, they're immortal, they're self-important, they're the apostles of the Lord Jesus Christ. This is Matthew 18. They knew that Christ was the Christ in Matthew 16. And he says, okay, guys, now you've gotten the doctrine down. You're starting to get this stuff. Unless you guys change and become like little children, meaning very humble, thankful, expectant from others, and realizing you need help, you will absolutely not enter the kingdom of heaven. Verse 4, therefore, whoever will humble himself as this little child, that one is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Verse 5, and whoever receives one such little child in my name receives me. And that's just beautiful. And of course, I think that that's one of the things I see in Christian people around the world is they're so kind. For the most part, they're so kind to children. And then basically having that really humble attitude, just really taking ourselves down a peg or two and having that super humble attitude. So that's Matthew 18. Let's go to Matthew 19. And in Matthew 19, verse 27, and this is another verse that shows you that Peter was really getting it. He was really getting the teaching of Christ. Verse 27, then Peter answered and said to him, see, we have left everything and followed you. So what will we have? What an honest question. You know, Peter had a fishing business. He had partners. Apparently he had boats. Very successful person. He, you know, just for where he was in life and at his age, he was very successful. And basically he handed that all off to people, and he's following Jesus Christ. And so I love the honesty in this question, that he just says, we have left everything and followed you. So what will we have? And I love what Christ did here, because Christ could have said, oh, it's time for another humility lesson. And he could have. But he balances that out. And look what he says to Peter. He says, and Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, that you who have followed me in the new beginning, you and I know that is Christ coming down, conquering the battle of Armageddon, and then that great unique day in Zechariah and everything starting over again, that he says, in the new beginning, my millennial kingdom, when the Son of Man sits on the throne of his glory, you also will sit on 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100-fold and will inherit life in the age to come. And so Jesus is just very honest here. Peter, a very honest question. We've left everything, Lord. What will we get? And he says, I'll tell you what you'll get. You'll sit on thrones. When I'm in my kingdom on earth, you're going to sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel, and you haven't left anything that you're not going to get 100-fold for when I set up my kingdom in the age to come. And then verse 30, but many who are first will be last, and the last first. And this is talking about the people who have advantages in the world, and then what they do is they scrape and claw and fight and try to get to the top of their fleshly power. And it's the top of what? You know, the top of a kingdom in this evil age. It's not worth it. And then you get to the kingdom and they end up like Christ had said earlier, the person who breaks these commands and teaches others to do so will be least in the kingdom. So we see this here in Matthew chapter 19, Matthew chapter 20, we kind of see the same thing. Let's go to Matthew chapter 20. And in verse 20, this is kind of interesting, because the apostles were obviously then talking to their family members, and their family members were getting it. And so this is James and John. You know, there was Peter, James, and John. Well, this is the mother of the sons of Zebedee. So this is the mother of James and John. So James and John are right at the top of the heap of the apostles. And the mother of the sons of Zebedee came to him with her sons, James and John, bowing down and asking something from him. And he said of her, what do you want? She says to him, say that these, my two sons, may sit one on your right and one on your left in your kingdom. And what was she asking? She understood rewards perfectly. She says, I want to make sure that my sons are the number one and the number two man in your kingdom. I mean, that's a very powerful question. And verse 22, Jesus answered her, I'm sure, very kindly, but very honestly. And he said, you do not know what you're asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I'm about to drink? They said to him, we are able. Actually, that was an overstatement, because on the night of Christ's arrest, what did they do? Well, they ran away. So they, this is, and I'm sure Christ got a kick out of this later, that people kind of overestimate their ability and what they can do. Verse 23 says to them, well, yeah, you only drink of my cup, which they did eventually. Both, they were eventually martyred down the line. But to sit on my right hand and on my left is not mine to give. He just says, look, he was a human being. He was a Messiah. He didn't know the heart of every person on earth and all the people who'd ever lived. So he says, it's not mine to give. It's for those for whom it's been prepared by my Father. What's unique, what's wonderful to me here is he doesn't say those positions don't exist. He says there are people out there that are going to have those positions, but it's people that my Father has prepared those positions and for those people. And and you and I, we don't know where we're going to be in the hierarchy of things in the kingdom to come, but I assure you that you and I are going to meet these two people, whoever they are. Well, you might be one of them. And it's just an amazing thing to think about this. And then he says, verse 24, when the 10 heard it, they were indignant with the two brothers. Why? Sure, because they felt like they were potentially missing out on something here. But Jesus, having called them near, said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it will not be this way among you. But whoever among you desires to become great will be your servant. And whoever wants to be first among you will be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And what a great line here for you and I. I mean, this is one of these decoupage hanging on your wall type lines, because it's something that we've got to keep, kind of like as James, when we were talking about repetition and repeating things. Wow, that whoever among you desires to become great will be your servant. And what a kind of a great personal line, that if I want to be great among people, then my goal is to be the best servant. That's just an amazing truth. Anyway, so Matthew chapter 25. And by Matthew chapter 25, obviously we're getting toward the end of Christ's life. He's actually on the Mount of Olives in Matthew chapter 25. And he tells the parable of the talents. And he was answering the question, Matthew chapter 24:3, what will be the signs of your coming and of the end of the age? And he started answering that and went through chapter 24 and chapter 25. And in verse 14 of chapter 25, for the kingdom of heaven is like when a man going on a journey called his own slaves and entrusted his property to them. And then we go down to verse 21, because a slave that had received 5 talents made 5 more talents. Verse 21, his Lord said to him, well done, good and faithful slave. You've been faithful over a few things. I will set you over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. So Christ here he's telling a parable, but he's telling it from the standpoint of, this is what we're supposed to do. We take the talents we've been given, and if we use those talents in a godly way and forward the kingdom, then God says, wow, you've been faithful over a few things. I'm going to give you many things. And this is really powerful. Look, I want to go forward to Luke. I want to go forward, all the way forward to Luke. And let's go to Luke chapter 19. So I think you guys probably are getting the idea here. Again, what was impressing me as I was doing this studying, reading through the Gospels from start to finish over again, was just how often rewards were part of the message of Jesus Christ. And why? Because it's true for one thing, but it's motivational. It's like, yeah, wow, I can do this. And in Luke chapter 19, verse 12. Let's see. Is that where I want to be? Yeah, Luke. Well, what did I do here? 19:12. Oh, yeah. Okay, got it. It is Luke 12. So Luke chapter 19, verse 12. I'll get this right. Luke chapter 19, verse 12. It's Christ's parable. He says, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive for himself a kingdom and then to return. And in these parables, like God is the man, God is the landowner, God is the king. Here, God is the nobleman. And verse 13, he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas and said to them, conduct business until I come. Now, in this parable is a little different than the parable in Matthew 25, because here we have 10 servants and each one of them gets a mina. And then basically verse 15, it came to pass when he returned, having received the kingdom, he commanded those servants to whom he'd given the money to be called to him so that he could know what they had gained by doing business. The first came before him saying, Lord, your mina has made 10 more minas. Verse 17, and he said to him, well done, you good servant, because you were found faithful in a very little, have authority over 10 cities. And this is a parable, but there's a lot of truth here. And I love how Christ, in the parable, the landowner who is God, or the nobleman who is God, says, you've been faithful over very little. Really, what we get to steward here in this life is actually very little. I mean, when you think about eternity and the kingdom of heaven, what we get to do here is very little. But if we're faithful over very little, in the parable he says, I'll put you over 10 cities, and that'll actually happen. There will in the kingdom, which is, remember the prophecies, the kingdom of Christ on earth is going to cover the entire earth. There'll be loads of cities, and there'll be people over those cities. And so here he says, you'll be over cities. And we'll close with 1 Corinthians 6, verse 2, because that's what's on the table for you and me. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2, or do you not know that the holy ones will judge and administer the world? And if the world is judged by you, are you incompetent to judge the trivial cases? And so, the scripture is really true about this, that, we're people that have been faithful to the Lord will help Christ administer the world. And that shows up in a number of places. So, there's more on rewards. There's a lot more on rewards. And, part of it's in my hope book. And then I'm, like I say, I'm in a kind of a continuing study. I'm in the middle of Luke right now, but I'm just reading through and writing down scriptures about rewards, just saying, how often does this occur? Does this occur? Does this concept of rewards occur as frequently as I think it does? I think it occurs quite a bit. And I think the church is doing Christian people a considerable disservice by not talking more about it, because I know I can speak for myself personally. There are many times where I have drawn energy by thinking about rewards, where I could not read the Bible that day, or not pray that day, or not do something else for the Lord, where I just kind of give myself a pep talk and say, I'm not willing to not serve God, to just serve myself right now. And I just draw energy from that. And so it's very helpful. And I think it does Christianity a disservice not to understand more about rewards. So anyway, I trust this has been a blessing. It's certainly been, it's been wonderful for me to just start in Matthew and just start reading all the way through. and writing down verses and see this come up and think about them. So anyway, that's what I wanted to share tonight. And I'm sure blessed that you guys were here. And thank you so much.